All right, welcome back, grade 10s. I need to remind you about our digital textbook, just because I know that our pandemic's not going away anytime soon. So I need to remind you that every day I do post on our Google Classroom what we do that day. And there's also a way to start taking this course asynchronously, meaning you could be getting ahead. Asynchronous means that everything's in place on our digital textbook all the way up to the final exam. So we can look at our digital textbook and there's links to each lesson. So for example, today we have moved into the foundation of contemporary globalization with lesson 15, sorry. And then tomorrow we'll be beginning contemporary globalization transnationals. So in that digital textbook that I shared with you, you can always just open up those documents and that tells you what we're doing that day. So I often will give some kind of reference to this in Google Classroom as well. So not saying that I'm predicting that we go to some kind of on-site, off-site hybrid approach or off-site completely. I'm not saying that we're going to go to that. What I am saying is if you find yourself off-site, you can certainly follow along, that it's all there. So, for example, this next hour in social studies today, we're going to be looking at the IMF, the World Bank, and GATT, and we have the links right there in the document. So everything's lined up for you, and it's also nice in case you ever have to review. So as you're reviewing for multiple choice, one of the things that could move you in terms of scoring higher at multiple choice is content knowledge and being able to recognize links between things. So as you go back and study, it's always good to revisit these lessons. So, one other thing I can mention is that as you follow me on YouTube, everything that I've been producing each day, not only am I putting the links in our digital textbook and mentioning them on our Google Classroom, I'm also putting them on our YouTube channel. So if you go to our channel, the Social 10 one, then we have 37 videos already, and we added 2 already today, and we'll be adding another one. So that's another way to keep current. I'm up to 13. Man, I had a good weekend. I'm pretty sure I was at 11 before the weekend.
Almost there?
Almost there. Once I'm at... Actually, I can't make these promises because I used to use Twitter for everything. And I said to my class that if I'd get to 1,000 followers, I'd retire. And I tweeted something in 2016 on the election day when Trump got elected. And for some reason, it got some kind of credibility or maybe followage. Suddenly it went from like 200 followers to like 14,000. And so the next day I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, I guess I'm supposed to retire. But most of them were just bots anyway, so they weren't actually people. But for a moment I did think I had to retire. So what are we going to do now? Now in our notes, all my colleagues, by the way, are freaking out because the diploma was just announced to be optional now. So they're wondering what that means and how they can create an in-house final exam. So that's fun. So if you were in grade 12 right now, that might be a little to your advantage. Have I been recording this already? I hope not. Did I say anything valuable? Well, we'll just keep talking. Yeah, we'll just keep going from this point. So we're going to continue with contemporary globalization. We're going to look at IMF, World Bank. We're going to distinguish between the IMF and World Bank. So when we leave here today, I want you to be able to know what the IMF and World Bank do. And the textbook actually does an exceptional job introducing the IMF and World Bank in that Venn diagram on page 228. So I think you should be aware of what's already in your textbook before you take extensive notes here. Because you don't want to be just writing down stuff that you already have a copy of. But we're going to want to be able to leave here today knowing more about the roles of the IMF and World Bank and some of the differences between them. As a secondary thing, we also want you to know about GATT and the WTO, and that's probably it. Looking forward to tomorrow. Tomorrow will be beginning chapter 10 and looking at transnationals. And I would say that academically, some of the stuff we do with transnationals is the most academic challenging stuff you'll see this year. Something to look forward to. You like to be challenged, right? No? I don't like to be challenged, but muscles only grow once they've been torn down, right? Like if you don't lift heavy, you don't grow. Did you just say you don't need a lift?
I don't need to grow, I'm fine.
Yeah. Oh, okay, that's fine.
Okay, Joel.
So lesson number 15, contemporary globalization. One of the things we are doing here today and a lot of days is trying to build argumentation. That as a province, one thing people struggle on is argumentation. So an argument that we'll be exploring this week is right here. In the selfish pursuit of unprecedented wealth and prosperity, we have sacrificed the common good and even common sense. So that's an argument that much of what we're going to do with transnationals will connect to, but also somewhat of what we're going to do with the foundation of globalization can connect to as well. What have we done so far? We looked at the first half of chapter 9, and we explored that there were many events that led to the need for Bretton Woods. What was Bretton Woods? Bretton Woods is a conference. So during World War II, so the world is at war, it's 1944. Hitler has not been defeated yet. The Japanese are still at their apex of the power. They still occupy much of China. So during a war, world leaders decide that they need to take time from the war and focus on something else. That should tell you how important it is. So we got this struggle like no struggle has ever been before, World War II. And during that, they're like, you know what? Let's go have a conference over here in the United States at a place called Bretton Woods and talk about something. Well, that's something they talk about must be pretty important. So what is the thing they talk about? Cooperation. Bretton Woods is about cooperation. It's that paradigm shift. So the cost of conflict had been staggering. World War I alone left 37 million casualties. We saw a different report of 40 million. Financial cost of at least $186 billion. Some would suggest maybe trillions of dollars today. And World War II will leave maybe as many as 90 million dead. So at the end of World War II, the countries are thinking, we need to rethink the way we relate. Globalization is the interconnectedness of mankind. The question now is not, do we connect, but how do we connect? Do we connect out of anger and competition, or can we connect out of cooperation? So, we lay a foundation at the Bretton Woods Conference for a new global village. You could argue no Bretton Woods, no globalization as we see it today. And in that global village, we have some pillars. A pillar, like a cornerstone, I have all these architectural metaphors. A pillar is like a leg of your desk. So if your desk was contemporary globalization, then one of the legs might be, oh, your desk is a little wobbly. It doesn't have really good legs. But one of the legs could be the IMF. Another leg might be the World Bank. This is the foundation of contemporary globalization, and that's why the textbook chapter is called Foundations of Economic Globalization. So we're about to look at a video on IMF, and one on the World Bank, and then one about the similarities and differences. And after the videos, I want you to be able to tell me what do they each do, what do they do that's similar, so what do they have in common, and how are they different. So the Venn diagram on page 228 is a start, but I want to kind of add to that. And that's really our main objective leaving here today in the second half of chapter 9. So, good news, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes. So I didn't just search for the first IMF and World Bank video. Now I looked through a lot and I tried to find the ones that were clear, but also concise. Because if we watch a 45-minute video on IMF, you're gonna get lost. We're gonna watch a long video tomorrow on corporations. So I have to choose my spots here.
When school isn't a place you have to be, why not go to school where remote learning can be?
So here we are in school, watching an ad promoting learning outside of school. The layers. You can do that. That's the whole point of my message, is that I'm putting everything online so that if you stayed home, you could be sitting under a tree right now with your iPad learning.
Who's getting service out there?
You could sit under a tree right next to some kind of tower. All right, IMF. Who's getting service?
On June 30th, 2015, Greece missed a major loan repayment deadline to the International Monetary Fund. The IMF provided 32 billion euros in emergency loans to keep the Greek economy from collapsing. So why did the...
So right now you're sitting there thinking, well, what does the IMF do? It provides emergency loans. Case in point, 2015 Greece. Wow, so much nicer talking without a mask on. So IMF provides emergency loans. IMF is created as one of the children of Bretton Woods. Why in 1944 would they create an organization that provides emergency loans? What's happening that makes the countries of the world say, you know what, we need something that provides emergency loans? Well, that something is the destruction of World War II. And they already know that eventually this war is over and countries will need to rebuild. And they may not have enough money to themselves. So we may need to help them. Talk about a paradigm shift. It used to be that the strong would feed on the weak, and now the strong are saying we must make sure that the weak don't become too weak. So why is it in the interest of the United States to lend money to France to rebuild? Because if the United States doesn't lend money to France to rebuild, instead of rebuilding, France might become desperate. And what happened to Germany after World War I when they became desperate? They turned to fascism. What happened to the Russians when they became desperate? They turned to communism. So in order to avoid a third world war, in order to avoid allowing the seeds of these totalitarian regimes to grow out of desperation and chaos, the United States says, you know what, we are the strong. We need to help the weak so that they don't become communist or fascist, that they don't get tempted by these poisonous ideologies. So what does the IMF do? They help the strong, help the weak. Wow, this is weird, right? Compared to what we talked about. They help the strong, help the weak by providing emergency loans. World War II's over, all your bridges were destroyed. Here's some money, build some bridges. World War II's over, a lot of your railway lines were destroyed. Let's build some railway. The Germans have occupied you for years. You're going to need to rebuild your country. You don't have the money to do it. Here's some money. Go get it done. But then the world decides, after those countries did rebuild, they said, you know what, there's always going to be some need for us. So 2015, Greece is in shambles again. The IMF says, here's some money, rebuild. So big thing that the IMF does, emergency loans.
The IMF take a risk on such an unstable economy? And what exactly is the IMF? The IMF was created alongside the World Bank in 1945 as overlapping finance arms of the United Nations. The World Bank focuses on financing and investing in developing countries, as well as eliminating poverty. The IMF primarily monitors exchange rates, stabilizes international monetary systems, and fosters global financial cooperation. Since World War II, the world's...
All right, so he said a lot while I was playing with my mask. Fosters global cooperation. So if we want this thing to work, this global village to work, we need to cooperate. How do we allow it to cooperate? Well, we need institutions that will foster cooperation. Instead of fostering competition, we need to foster cooperation. What's an institution that can do that? The IMF. So what might be an obstacle to cooperation? Poverty. When some countries look at others and say, well, why are you so rich and we're so poor? That causes envy, and out of envy comes hatred, and from hatred can come war. How can we deal with the root causes of hatred? Let's deal with the root causes of inequality. Let's help the rich, help the poor. Talk about a paradigm shift. So, we're fostering cooperation through loans that can enable countries to have some of the benefits that they see in other countries.
Economies have become interdependent on each other through trade and investment. While this helps strengthen the global financial system, it also creates weaknesses in the economic chain. When an unforeseeable crisis, like a recession or a natural disaster, destabilizes one nation's economy, that can severely affect dependent countries.
So what's happening is countries are becoming interdependent, and when you become interdependent, sometimes it creates vulnerability. So if we let the Greeks suffer their economic turmoil in isolation, then the Greek economic virus doesn't infect us. But because we lend money to the Greeks, and then if the Greeks say we can't lend you the money back, now we catch a little bit of that economic sickness. So there is some vulnerability in interdependence. So if you see me sitting on the side of a task one in 5 years, and I'm down on my luck, and I'm panhandling, and you're like, Mr. McBride, you enjoy that visual, do you? You seem to really enjoy that. Mr. McBride, here's $1,000. I can loan you $1,000 so that you can overcome some of your hardship. Now I owe you $1,000. If I don't give you that $1,000 back, now you will be inconvenienced $1,000. So the economic hardship grows. So that's the same thing with the World Bank and the IMF, is it does give us an opportunity to foster cooperation, but in this interdependence comes some vulnerability.
The balancing force of the IMF prevents any potential domino effect in collapsing economies. The IMF is one of several global banks that provides loans to troubled economies to promote a stable world economy. The IMF and its sister organization, the World Bank, tend to serve more Western interests, like the US and the EU, while other global banks, like the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, serve Chinese and Russian interests more. In total, the IMF has 188 member states. After the global financial crisis of 2008, African countries were hit hard. The demand for imported goods from Africa declined, and international growth rates slowed. In response, the IMF proactively made billions of dollars available to places like Ghana at extremely low interest rates. With this support, Ghana's growth rate increased to over 9% in 2011 and remains one of Africa's frontier emerging markets.
So what's the significance of the IMF? Well, they understand that because of the changing tides of global trade, that people are going to be consuming less African products. So they understand that if exporting countries like Ghana don't have those opportunities to export, then it's going to lead to poverty there, and poverty in African countries often means death. So how do we save lives? Well, let's lend them some money so they can diversify their economy.
Currently, the IMF's biggest borrowers are Portugal, Greece, Ireland, and Ukraine. The IMF also gives precautionary loans as a sort of preventative measure before things get too bad. Receivers of precautionary loans include Mexico, Poland, Colombia, and Morocco. Despite their support, the IMF has been widely criticized for allowing disparate levels of influence. This is because member nations which invest more money in the IMF get more voting rights. The US comprises nearly a fifth of all available votes because they are the largest contributor.
So because the US are the largest contributor of money that then the IMF can go out and provide loans with, often people criticize the IMF as being a puppet of the US. A puppet. They see the IMF as a puppet. That the US is committing neo-imperialism, controlling other countries through the IMF. So the problem with social studies for some students is because it's not 2 + 2 is 4. That we're telling you the IMF's good today, also telling you the IMF's bad today. Telling you multiple perspectives on the same thing. And that can be confusing. We just said IMF's great, they provide emergency loans and all these things. And then in the next breath they say, the IMF is seen as a puppet of the US. And we saw that in Bolivia, that the IMF provided Cochabamba a loan. Here's some money, now you can rebuild your infrastructure of your sewage system, but there's some conditions with the loan. In order to get the money, you must privatize. And who benefited from the privatization? US interests. So the IMF is seen as an instrument of good and an instrument of evil. An instrument that provides helpful emergency loans, for restructuring and saving countries when they're facing ruin, like Ghana was in 2009. But as we saw in Bolivia, often it seems like the IMF is serving the US interests. So here's a case study right now. The IMF that you could be using on your final exam essay about how, we have this conflict in the world. And one of the comments that some people had on their essay might have been, man, I need more detail. Where do you get detail from? From detailed notes. Unless you have some kind of photographic memory and you don't, then you need to take notes. Or you get to rewatch this at home.
Additionally, since the IMF is somewhat of a last resort, countries in trouble have no choice but to agree to significant austerity measures that may not...
Mr. McBride, what does the word austerity mean? They just use the word, and it must be important because it's even in the title. What does austerity mean, Mr. McBride? I don't know what it means. You know what? I am gifted with a class because all of you already know what it means because no one asked. Not a single person asked what austerity means. Sir, yes, sir.
What does austerity mean?
Well, austerity means is very similar to fiscal responsibility or fiscal conservatism. Austerity means that the government must cut their expenses and try to spend less so that they're not bankrupting future generations. So when you think of austerity, think of the opposite of our Prime Minister, who is spending hundreds of billions of dollars of future taxpayer money, right? He's committing intergenerational tyranny by creating debt to people, Canadians that haven't been born yet. He's spending money of people that haven't been born yet. Austerity is the opposite. Austerity is this idea that, we need to be careful of how much we're spending because it's not sustainable. Right? It's not sustainable to just spend hundreds of billions of dollars. It's not sustainable. So austerity means fiscal responsibility. Basically, let's not spend more than we make.
Necessarily be in their best interests or agree with their ideologies. While the IMF is a powerful force within the world economic balance, it also openly serves the interests of its member countries. With so much influence in the political policies of struggling countries, it is dangerous to try and treat domestic problems with simple cash infusions and austerity measures. However, without it,
and I'm even borrowing my language, right? Remember I said one of the things we can elevate is language. Cash infusions, right? Cash infusions, like a blood infusion. If you need healthier blood, I guess, I'm not a doctor. When would you get a blood infusion? Because you don't have enough of your own blood, right? Because you don't have enough healthy blood. So you also have cash infusions. There's not enough local homegrown cash, so countries may provide cash loans to a country that needs more resources, like France in 1945. So cash infusions might be
countries like Greece may face worse alternatives. If Greece leaves the Eurozone over money woes, it would be devastating to all of Europe.
So what do we not want them to do? We don't want countries to become so impoverished that they just quit the global village. Because as they quit the global village, as more countries opt out, the world economy will slow and potentially even shrink. So it's in our best interest as a collective to keep everybody engaged in the same global economic game. So that's the IMF. Next up, we're going to look at the World Bank. So under IMF, you might have things down like cash infusions. You might have down emergency loans. Those are my main points. Anybody get anything else? Sometimes they will provide some advice. So they might go to a country and say, you know what, your agricultural industry could be more productive if you use these tools instead. So there might be actually some technical advice provided as well. So let's look at the World Bank and see what they do.
It can be scary for people to call a lawyer.
We'll help you out regardless of what your matter is, or even if we can't help you, we're going to help you find the right solution.
We put the personal injury law.
We put the personal.
With thousands of employees and 189 member countries, the World Bank is one of the most powerful institutions in the world, funneling billions of dollars every year into ending global poverty. But
boom, what do they do? What's on the to-do list of the World Bank? End global poverty. So more than any generation ever before, you're, given this new reality, you're going to be learning in isolation at times. You're going to be sitting, watching a video, doing these kinds of things and say, well, what's the important points? So hopefully these next few weeks will give us a chance to, grow as learners, right? Because everybody in here, you're on a path to post-secondary. We want to make sure you can be successful when you get there. Even if there means, at home at your house, taking it online.
But as the World Bank has grown larger, it's also become more dysfunctional. High-budget projects with little oversight have reportedly led to corruption, cover-ups, and severe unintended consequences.
So we know what they do, but how do we know that they're controversial? They're connected with corruption. Much like the IMF, the controversy part there was that it's a puppet of the US. The World Bank, the argument is it could be corrupt.
So what exactly is the World Bank, and how did it get so powerful? Well, the World Bank, like many other international organizations, was created in the aftermath of World War II. In 1944, as the war was coming to an end, Allied nations, including the United States.
Where did they meet? So in 1944, they met. Bretton Woods, thank you. Woo! That was a very deflating moment when it was like silence.
States in the United Kingdom created the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD,
So if the IBRD becomes the World Bank, what is their purpose? Well, reconstruction, right? A big part of it is let's reconstruct Europe and other war-torn countries so that we can prevent them from being tempted by extreme solutions like fascism and communism. We just lost 90 million people to fascism. We don't want to replicate that. Now that we have atomic weapons, maybe next time it will be 900 million people lost to extremism. So how do we prevent extremism? Well, we must combat poverty and desperation by becoming more interdependent and cooperating, by creating a World Bank that can help people come out of poverty.
Rebuild Europe. In 1947, this bank issued its first loan to France, which had been heavily bombed during the war, and it financed similar initiatives throughout the 1940s and 50s. Eventually, the IBRD became known colloquially as the World Bank. In the early 1970s, as post-war reconstruction was winding down, the World Bank shifted its...
So they say, you know what, France has been rebuilt. Who can we rebuild now? Oh, right, it's almost that time, isn't it? France has been rebuilt. Who can we rebuild now? Well, now let's turn our attention to the developing world. Let's turn our attention to Africa and Asia and help maybe lift people there out of poverty. This begins to look like a lot like what the White Man's Burden poem was meant to be. Instead of the White Man's Burden meaning that King Leopold II went to Congo and had 10 million people serve his need, the World Bank can actually be, if used properly, help people overcome poverty. It could be the rich, the powerful, helping the weak.
Focus to reducing global poverty. Instead of funding only construction projects like building dams and generating electricity, the bank oversaw programs related to food production, health, nutrition, and development, all addressing poor communities. By the early 1980s, the World Bank...
So that's giving you some more specifics too. What does the World Bank do? Let's help you with food production. Let's help you overcome poverty. Let's help you with education. Let's give you those cornerstones of a functioning society. So what's a cornerstone of a functioning society? Public health. So we're going to bring doctors to you. We're going to bring modern medicine. We're going to build hospitals. So this is the humanitarian part that Rudyard Kipling wanted the white man's burden to be.
Bank wasn't only made up of finance and infrastructure experts like economists and engineers, but also society-focused experts like anthropologists and social scientists. These experts not only collaborate on infrastructure projects, but work with local governments on policies and institutions that bring people out of poverty. For instance, in India, the World Bank has funded the construction of nearly 10,000 miles of roads that connect poor rural communities to schools, markets, and clean water sources.
There you go. So India, soon to be the most populated place on earth. We have people that are living in isolated communities without clean water. What can we do? Well, we can build a road so they can get to clean water. So now instead of the strong feeding on the weak, like the British Empire did in India, now we have interests like the British helping the Indian people. It's a paradigm shift. Hopefully, the course becomes so repetitive in a day, you're like at the end of class, you're like, hey, guess what? I think I know what a paradigm shift is. It's a V cut.
The project stimulated rural economies and improved quality of life for thousands of people. In the past 45 years, the World Bank's objectives have largely remained unchanged. The bank's two stated goals are to reduce extreme poverty, that is, people living on less than roughly $2 a day, and to raise incomes of the poorest 40% of the population. It plans to do this by issuing low-interest loans and low to zero interest credits and grants to develop.
So their main goal, let's get rid of poverty, right? How do we do it? Let's give as close to free money as possible. Free money meaning let's have low interest loans. If we give a loan to a country and the interest rate is 20%, whose interest is that loan serving? The person who's getting interest. But if we can give a loan or a no interest loan to a country, then whose interest could be serving? Well, it might be serving the local people if they need that money being spent there.
Developing countries. Oftentimes, the World Bank funds initiatives on its own, but it also partners with governments, private banks, and other organizations like the World Trade Organization or the UN. The World Bank gets its funds by selling bonds to investors, collecting subscription fees from member governments, and net earnings from its assets. But many have alleged that these projects often hurt the poor rather than help them. According to a 2015 investigative report, nearly 3.5 million people have been displaced over the last decade to make room for World Bank-funded projects. The organization has rules for so-called.
So one of the complexities that we see here is that there's a lot of globalists that see the World Bank and the IMF as instruments of evil. So why would they see it as evil? Well, we just learned that some of these projects that the IMF and World Bank fund, you're lucky, you're going to be twice as clean. Some of the projects that the World Bank and the IMF fund displace millions of people. So when you see millions of people become refugees because of money that the World Bank and the IMF has lent, you can see why people would start questioning if these institutions really are good.
Involuntary resettlement, ensuring that families are not forced from their homes without warning, and that those who are evicted are safely resettled elsewhere. However, the World Bank has reportedly failed on many occasions to live up to these standards. For instance, in 2007, the bank loaned nearly $70 million to Kenya's National Forest Service for a conservation project. However, Kenyan authorities reportedly used the money to forcefully evict thousands of indigenous people who had been living in the project area. Between 2007 and 2014, up to 1,000 indigenous homes had been ransacked or burned to the ground.
So the World Bank lends $70 million to Kenya to help reforest, and the World Bank thinks, hey, we're doing some good stuff. But then the Kenyan government uses that money to basically push indigenous peoples away from that area and in the process, creating refugees.
Representatives from the World Bank have acknowledged flaws in their involuntary resettlement program, but have yet to make any major changes. This isn't the only criticism of the World Bank. Many allege that loans to developing countries end up in the pockets of corrupt leaders.
So you may end up seeing an A1 source like this. So A1 sources can be photographs, and within photographs you'll have protesters, and here you have the World Bank and the IMF being villainized as they're shaking money from this child, and they're connecting the World Bank and the IMF to greed, and they're mentioning that that we need to fight against these because the interests of capitalists have been funneled through the World Bank and IMF to basically buy what should be commonly owned, our planet. So you may end up getting an A1 like this at some point in the near future.
Others criticize the way the institution is governed, which gives considerable power to a small number of Western countries. Representatives from the World Bank have said they're looking for better ways of achieving their goals. So while the bank remains a noble entity working to end global poverty, it seems it has its own problems to fix as well.
All right, so the last thing we're going to do, we have 8 minutes left, and we have a 5-minute video that shows the differences between the IMF and World Bank. So you should be able to leave here today understanding a little bit more about the IMF World Bank. We'll talk about GATT and the WTO tomorrow, and then we'll jump into chapter 11 or chapter 10.
If you're confused by the difference between the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank, well, you're not the only one.
You're not the only one!
Why should you switch backgrounds?
It's a different video. Is it the same girl? Wasn't the other girl, I'm just going to say here, wasn't she Asian?
Yeah.
She has more flags than you.
So, she has more flags on display.
Famed economist John Maynard Keynes, who was a founding father of both institutions, said that he was confused just by their names. The IMF and the World Bank are closely linked, so close that their headquarters are across the street from each other here in Washington. So what's the difference between them? It all started at this hotel in New Hampshire in July 1944, where 44 countries gathered for the Bretton Woods Conference. The goal of the conference was to agree on a new framework for the international monetary system, which is the rules and institutions that keep the global economy running smoothly. After World War II, most people agreed that the old system had failed. It had seen the Great Depression, unfair trade policies, and unstable currencies. After 3 weeks of heated negotiations at Bretton Woods, especially between Keynes, who was representing the United Kingdom, and Harry Dexter White, the U.S. Treasury representative, a deal was reached. The agreement created the IMF and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, soon to be known as the World Bank. Each institution was given a distinct role. The IMF's job was to oversee a system of fixed exchange rates, which tied the value.
There you go. So something we need to add to IMF. They oversee a system of fixed exchange rates. So we can try to figure out how much each person's currency means or is worth. So if we know how much each currency is worth, then it makes global trade easier. How do you trade between England and the United States? Well, we need to know how much the English currency is worth compared to the US currency. That can take a lot of time, and it can slow the global village down, can slow the commerce down. How do we speed up commerce? We need to have a system in place that says this is how much each currency is worth. And that system is created by the IMF.
The country's currency to the US dollar, which was pegged to gold. The main purpose of this was to make sure exchange rates stayed stable, to encourage global trade. The IMF was also tasked with providing short-term loans to countries struggling to pay their debts. Meanwhile, the main goal of the World Bank was to give financial assistance to countries, mainly in Europe, that needed to rebuild after the war.
So the World Bank is rebuilding countries after the war by giving them assistance. The IMF is saying we want to provide easier opportunities to trade, so we want to make sure that it's clear how much currencies are worth.
The roles of both the IMF and the World Bank have changed a lot since the days of Bretton Woods. President Nixon unpegged the US dollar from gold in 1971, essentially dissolving the fixed exchange rate system that the IMF oversaw. Since then, the IMF has taken on a bigger role fighting financial crises around the world. It keeps tabs on the global economy and puts economic policies in place in member countries. The World Bank focuses its efforts on development and reducing poverty.
And that word poverty has come up a lot in terms of one of the things the World Bank is fighting today.
It provides funding and resources in projects in some of the poorest countries in the world. Both institutions include 189 member countries, but the IMF has around 2,700 employees, compared to the World Bank staff of 10,000. The IMF is funded mainly by quotas, basically subscription fees from member countries. It receives around $675 billion in quotas, with the US, Japan, China, and Germany contributing the most. The World Bank is financed mostly by issuing bonds to global investors. The group's lending commitments reached nearly $59 billion in fiscal year 2017. The IMF has committed $160 billion under its current lending arrangements. Today, the IMF's biggest borrowers include Greece, Ukraine, Portugal, and Pakistan. The places where the World Bank is running the most projects are in Africa and East Asia. One thing the IMF and the World Bank have in common is that they both have some opponents. Critics point to the conditions attached to their loans, saying they don't always address the specific economic issues within a country. The IMF has come under fire for continuing to bail out Greece, even as the country has failed to clean up its finances. Human rights groups have criticized.
What policy could the Greeks practice to clean up their finances? Somebody please say it. What's the name of the policy? Clean up your finances? Austerity, yeah.
Criticize the World Bank for ignoring the environmental and social impacts of some of its projects in countries like Ethiopia or Myanmar. But the IMF and the World Bank say they promote global economic stability. They make countries less vulnerable to crises, promote higher living standards, and provide vital help to countries that need it.
There it is. So you should be able to leave here today knowing the IMF and World Bank.